There are moments in life when you realize that everything you thought you understood about the world, about faith, about medicine, about the very fabric of reality itself, was just a thin curtain hiding something far more vast and mysterious. I had one of those moments in the winter of 2022, standing in a hospital room in Bergamo, watching my mother breathe on her own for the first time in 3 weeks, while 2 oncologists stared at scan results they could not explain, and a priest who had already administered last rites sat in the corner with tears streaming down his face. My name is Elena Rossetti, and this is the story of how Carlo Acutis brought the unexpected to my family when every door had closed and every hope had died. I need to take you back to the beginning, to a time when my mother was the strongest woman I knew, the anchor of our entire family, the one who held everything together with her capable hands and her warm, knowing smile. My mother, Giuliana Rossetti, was 63 years old when this story begins, a retired elementary school teacher who had dedicated 35 years of her life to shaping young minds in the schools of Bergamo. She was the kind of woman who woke up at 5 in the morning to prepare fresh pasta dinner, who remembered the birthdays of every former student she had ever taught, who could silence a room full of arguing relatives with a single raised eyebrow. Her energy seemed inexhaustible, her patience infinite, her capacity for love boundless. My mother had grown up in a small village outside Bergamo, the youngest of 4 children in a family that worked the land and attended Mass every Sunday without fail. She had met my father at a parish dance when she was 19, and they had married 2 years later in the same church where she had been baptized. They built their life together with patience and determination, saving enough money for a modest apartment in the city, raising my brother Luca and me with firm discipline and unconditional love. My mother taught during the day and cooked elaborate meals in the evening. She helped us with homework and attended every school performance and sporting event. She was the first person we called with good news, and the shoulder we cried on when life became difficult. My father had passed away 7 years earlier from a heart attack, sudden and devastating, collapsing in the garden one Saturday morning while pruning the roses my mother loved so much. The paramedics worked on him for 30 minutes. He was already gone. We had all watched my mother grieve with a quiet dignity that seemed almost superhuman. She missed him terribly. We all knew that. But she refused to let his death diminish her engagement with love. She wore black for a year, as tradition demanded, but she did not withdraw from the world. Instead, she threw herself even more fully into service to others. She volunteered at the local parish, helping with catechism classes for children preparing for their first communion. She joined a walking group that met every Tuesday and Thursday morning in the park near her apartment, a collection of widows and retired who had become her closest friends. She learned to use a smartphone so she could video call with my brother Luca, who lived in Munich with his German wife Heike and their 2 children, Anna and Thomas. She babysat my son Matteo every Wednesday afternoon while I finished my classes at the school where I taught, spoiling him with homemade biscotti and endless stories about the old days. In the summers, she would take Matteo to the small village where she had grown up, showing him the house where she was born, the fields where she had played as a child, the church where she had received all her sacraments. He wanted him to understand his roots, to know where he came from, to feel connected to the generations that preceded him. These were precious times, grandmother and grandson walking hand in hand through the narrow streets, past the stone houses and ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of births and deaths and all the ordinary moments in between. In September of 2022, my mother mentioned during one of our weekly dinners she had been feeling unusually tired lately. I remember the exact moment, sitting across from her at her kitchen table, a plate of her famous risotto growing cold in front of me as I studied her face with sudden concern. She looked thinner. I noticed for the first time, her cheeks slightly hollowed, dark circles forming beneath her eyes that her usual good humor could not quite display. I asked if she was sleeping well, eating properly, taking care of herself. She waved away my questions with characteristic dismissiveness. She was 63, she reminded me. A little fatigue was perfectly normal at her age, nothing to worry about. But by October, the fatigue had become something else entirely. She stopped going to her walking group, calling her friends with excuses about minors and appointments. She started declining invitations to babysit Matteo, something she had never done before in the 5 years since his birth, and when I pressed her, she would only say that she was not feeling up to it that particular day. When I visited her apartment unannounced one Tuesday afternoon, I found her lying on the sofa in the middle of the day, still in her housecoat, the television murmuring unwatched in the corner. My mother was not a woman who rested during daylight hours. My mother was perpetual motion, constant activity, endless energy directed toward the care of others. Seeing her like that sent a cold spike of fear through my chest. I convinced her to see Dr. Martinelli, a general practitioner, a kind man in his 50s who had known our family for years and had cared for my father during his. He examined my mother thoroughly, asking questions about her symptoms, her appetite, her sleep pattern. He ran some blood tests, expecting to find nothing more than a vitamin deficiency or perhaps mild anemia, something that could be easily corrected with supplements and rest. What he found instead was a series of alarming markers that led to more tests, then more tests after that, each one revealing another piece of a picture that grew darker with every passing day. The referral to the oncology department at Papa Giovanni XXIII Hospital came in early November. My mother went to the appointment alone, despite my protests, insisting that there was no need to worry everyone over what was probably nothing serious. She called me that evening, her voice steady in a way that told me she was working very hard to keep it so, and said simply that we needed to have a family meeting. She would not tell me more over the phone. She wanted to say it once, to everyone, and she wanted us all to be together when she did. Luca flew in from Munich the next day, taking emergency leave from his job at a pharmaceutical company. We gathered in my mother's living room, the same room where we had celebrated countless Christmases and birthdays and family gatherings, and Dr. Francesca Bianchi, the oncologist who had taken over my mother's case, joined us via video call to explain what they had found. Her words were clinical and precise, delivered with the practiced compassion of someone who had done this hundreds of times before, but I could see in her eyes, even through the small screen, that she knew she was handing us a death sentence. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer with metastasis to the liver and lymph nodes. The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through all of us. Dr. Bianchi explained that pancreatic cancer is one of the most aggressive and difficult to treat forms of the disease, particularly when caught at such an advanced stage. The tumors were too widespread for surgical removal. Chemotherapy might slow the progression, might buy some time, but it would not cure. We spoke of palliative care, of symptom management, of making the remaining time as comfortable as possible. When Luca asked directly how long my mother had, Dr. Bianchi paused for a long moment before answering. 2 to 3 months at the outside, she said, possibly less. It was impossible to predict exactly, but we should be prepared for the worst. I remember my mother receiving this news with remarkable calm, reaching over to take my hand, as if I were the one who. She asked Dr. Bianchi about the treatment options, about what to expect as the disease progressed, about how to manage symptoms. We thanked the doctor for her honesty and her compassion. After the call ended, she looked at Luca and me with those steady brown eyes that had guided us through every crisis of our lives and told us that she was ready to face whatever came next. She had lived a good life. She had raised 2 wonderful children. She had loved and been loved. She was not afraid to die. We were afraid. We were terrified. In the days that followed, Luca and I threw ourselves into research, desperate to find some treatment option that Dr. Bianchi might have overlooked, some clinical trial that might offer hope, some specialist in some distant city who had achieved miracles with cases like mine. We found nothing. Every avenue we explored led to the same conclusion. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer with metastasis was essentially a death sentence. The statistics were devastating. The 5-year survival rate was measured in single digits. Most patients did not survive more than a few months after diagnosis. Dr. Bianchi started my mother on a palliative chemotherapy regimen, not with any expectation of cure, but simply to manage symptoms and perhaps slow the disease's relentless advance. The treatments were administered at the hospital's oncology unit, in a room full of other patients hooked up to IV drips, all of them fighting their own private wars against the cells that had turned traitor inside their bodies. My mother sat through the infusions with quiet patience, reading books about the saints or praying the rosary while the toxic chemicals dripped into her veins. She never complained, even when the side effects began to mount. The treatments left my mother nauseated and exhausted, her already diminished strength fading further with each passing week. She lost her appetite almost entirely, forcing herself to eat small amounts of bland food only because we begged her to try. Her hair began to thin, and she took to wearing a soft cap that I had bought for her, embarrassed by the physical evidence of her treatment, even though she never would have judged another person for the thing. By early December, she had lost nearly 20 pounds from a frame that had already been slender to begin with. Her skin took on a yellowish tinge as her liver struggled under the burden of the spreading cancer. The whites of her eyes turned the color of. She needed help getting out of bed, help bathing, help with tasks she had performed independently. The woman who had cared for everyone else all her life now needed to be cared for, and though she accepted our ministrations with grace, I could see how much it cost her pride. I moved into her apartment to care for her full time, taking a leave of absence from my teaching job, and leaving Roberto to manage our household while I sat by my mother's bedside, watching her slip away, piece by piece, hour by hour, day by day. The doctors came regularly. Dr. Bianchi and her team of oncology nurses, adjusting medications, managing pain, monitoring the progression of the disease. But their visits had taken on a hospice quality that no one acknowledged openly, but everyone understood. They no longer spoke of fighting the disease or achieving remission. They spoke of comfort, of dignity, of making her remaining time as peaceful as possible. The battle, such as it was, had been lost before it truly began. Now we were simply managing the retreat. Father Domenico, the pastor of Santa Maria Immacolata, where my mother had volunteered for years, came every few days to visit. He was a man in his late 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that had witnessed every dimension of human suffering during his 4 decades as a priest. He brought communion, consecrating it especially for my mother when she became too weak to attend Mass. He prayed with her, reciting the familiar prayers of the church that she had known since childhood. He sat and talked about inconsequential things that made her smile, memories of parish events, and amusing stories about his early years as a young priest in a tiny village in Calabria. But even Father Domenico, a man of deep and genuine faith who had spent his life proclaiming the power of God, seemed to have accepted what was coming. He spoke to me privately in the kitchen one afternoon while my mother dozed in the next room about preparing for her passing. He talked about the comfort of the sacraments, about the hope of eternal life, about the resurrection of the body and the promise of heaven. He offered to help us plan the funeral when the time came. He was not speaking as a man who expected a miracle. He was speaking as a shepherd guiding his flock through the valley of the death, faithful to his calling but realistic about the outcome. I asked him once, during one of those difficult conversations, whether we should pray for a miracle. He considered the question carefully before answering. Prayer is always good, he said. God hears every prayer, even if he does not always answer in the way we hope. But he cautioned me against expecting what he called supernatural intervention. God works through natural means, he explained, through doctors and medicines and the ordinary processes of the body. Miraculous healings do happen, he acknowledged, but they are rare, and we should not stake our peace of mind on receiving one. Better to pray for acceptance, for strength, for the grace to face whatever comes with faith and dignity. His words were kind and reasonable, the words of a wise pastor who had counseled many families through, but they left me feeling more empty than before. Even the priest, it seemed, given up hope of anything beyond the ordinary diet. Even the man of God saw no way out for my mother except the way that led through the valley of death. By the second week of December, Dr. Bianchi discontinued the chemotherapy. It was causing more harm than good, he explained during a home visit, her face grave as she reviewed my mother's latest test. My mother's body could no longer tolerate even the reduced doses. The cancer was advancing despite the treatment, and the side effects were destroying what little quality of life remained. There was nothing more that medicine could offer. We should focus on keeping her comfortable, managing her pain, ensuring that she did not suffer unnecessarily. She might have days, perhaps a week or 2 at most. He suggested we contact hospice services to ensure proper end-of-life care. I cannot adequately describe the darkness that descended on our family during those days. It was not just grief, though there was certainly grief in abundance, a preemptive mourning for a loss that had not yet occurred, but felt already inevitable. It was something deeper, something more profound, something that touched the very foundations of my faith and my understanding of the world. It was the complete absence of hope. Every medical option had been exhausted. Every prayer seemed to fall on deaf ears. My mother was dying, slipping further away with each passing hour, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. I prayed constantly during those dark December days, though my prayers felt hollow and mechanical. I knelt beside my mother's bed at night and begged God to spare, give us more time, to perform a miracle like the ones I had read about in the lives of saints. I prayed the rosary until my fingers were sore from the beads. I attended Mass every morning at Santa Maria Immacolata, receiving communion and pleading with Jesus to hear my desperate cries. But heaven seemed closed. The prayers went up, but nothing came back. I began to wonder if anyone was listening at all. Father Domenico came on December 18th to administer the sacrament we used to call last rites before the terminology changed. It was a solemn ceremony, conducted in the dim light of my mother's bedroom, with candles flickering on the nightstand and the crucifix that had hung above her bed for 40 years, looking down on the scene. My mother received the sacrament with her eyes closed, her lips moving silently, along with the Latin prayers she had known since her childhood. Luca and I stood on either side of her bed, holding her frail hands, watching as the priest traced the sign of the cross on her forehead with the holy oil, anointing her senses for the final journey. It felt like a farewell. It felt like the church itself was saying goodbye. providing the spiritual provisions for a voyage from which there would be no return. Father Domenico's voice cracked several times, ritual, betraying the emotion he was struggling to contain. When he finished, he blessed us all and promised to return the next day. We understood, without anyone saying it, that he would likely be called back soon to perform the final commendation, the prayers for the moment of death, the formal release of my mother's soul from her broken body. After Father Domenico left, I sat alone in the kitchen of my mother's apartment, staring at nothing, feeling utterly empty. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft beep of the medical equipment monitoring my mother's vital signs and the distant sounds of the city outside the window. Everything felt surreal, dreamlike, as if I had stepped out of normal reality into some parallel dimension where nightmares became flesh, and hope was just a word with no corresponding substance. I had prayed so hard over the past weeks. I had begged God for a miracle, for an intervention, for anything that might change the trajectory we were on. But my prayers felt like stones thrown into a bottomless well. I heard no response, felt no comfort. The heavens seemed as close to us as the doors of the oncology department. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling mindlessly through the blue light harsh against my exhausted eyes. It was nearly 2 a.m, that strange dead hour when the world seemed suspended between one day and the next, and I was lying on the sofa in my mother's living room, too tired to sleep but too anxious to rest. I do not remember exactly how I came across the article, whether through a shared post, or a suggested link, or some algorithm's mysterious workings. But there, in that dark hour of that dark night, with my mother sleeping fitfully in the next room, I found myself reading about a young Italian boy named Carlo Acutis, who had died of leukemia in 2006 and had been beatified by Pope Francis in 2020. I knew the name, vaguely. I had seen headlines about his beatification 2 years earlier, had heard him mentioned on Catholic radio programs as a potential patron saint of the internet because of his love for computers and his work cataloging Eucharistic miracles online. But I had never really paid attention. I was a practicing Catholic, yes, attending Mass every Sunday and observing the major feast days, but I had always been somewhat skeptical of modern miracles and newly proclaimed saints. My faith was more traditional, more reserved, focused on the established devotions of my childhood: the Blessed Virgin Mary, Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Anthony of Padua. The idea of praying to a teenager who had died only 16 years ago seemed strange and slightly uncomfortable, but something about Carlo's story caught me that night, something that pierced through my exhaustion and air. Perhaps it was the photograph of him that accompanied the article, a teenager with dark curly hair and an open, genuine smile, wearing a casual red polo shirt and looking like any number of students I had taught over the years. He looked so ordinary, so contemporary, so unlike the formal portraits of ancient saints with their halos and their solemn expression. Perhaps it was reading about his own death at 15 from leukemia, the same type of cancer that had taken him in just 3 days, the way he had accepted his suffering and offered it up for the Pope and for the Church. Perhaps it was the simple, direct way he had spoken about the Eucharist, calling it his highway to heaven, expressing a faith so pure and uncomplicated that it made my own seem cynical by comparison. I read for hours that night, following link after link, learning about this young man who had been born in London to Italian parents and raised in Milan. I read about how he had attended Mass daily from the age of 7, how he had taught himself to program computers and used his skills to create a website documenting Eucharistic miracles from around the world. I read about his devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, his love for animals, his concern for the poor and homeless people he encountered on the streets of Milan. I read about his final illness, how he had told his mother not to worry, how he had offered his suffering for how he had received his final communion with tears of joy streaming down. I learned that Carlo had died on October 12, 2006, just 3 days after being diagnosed with leukemia M3, a particularly aggressive form of the disease. He had been only 15 years old, a bright student at the Jesuit school Istituto Leone III in Milan, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. Yet he had faced his death with a peace and acceptance that seemed far beyond his years. He had asked for the anointing of the sick and for Holy Communion, receiving the Eucharist he loved so much one final time before slipping into a coma. He had told his mother that he offered his suffering for the Pope and for the Church, for the souls in purgatory, and that he wanted to skip purgatory and go straight to heaven. I read testimonies from people who claimed to have experienced his intercession, stories of healings and conversions and answered prayers. A young Brazilian boy named Mateus Viana had been miraculously healed of a rare pancreatic defect after his family prayed for Carlo's intercession in 2013. This was the miracle that had led to Carlo's beatification on October 10, 2020, officially recognized by the Church after years of rigorous investigation. But there were other stories too, unofficial accounts from ordinary people who believed that Carlo had heard their prayers and helped them in their time of need. People with sick children, people facing financial ruin, people struggling with addiction or depression or despair. They had turned to Carlo Acutis in their darkness, and they believed he had answered. I read about his body lying in the sanctuary, the Renunciation in Assisi, exhumed in 2019 and found to be remarkably preserved despite 13 years in the grave. The church had dressed him in his favorite clothes, jeans and a Nike tracksuit, and placed him in a glass reliquary where pilgrims could come to venerate his remains. There was something about this detail that struck me deeply. This modern teenager lying in a medieval, bridging the centuries between St. Francis. Carlo had loved Assisi, had visited the town many times with his family, had felt a special connection to St. Francis and his message of poverty and humility. It seemed fitting that he would rest there now, among the ancient stones and the olive groves, waiting for the resurrection. By the time dawn broke over Bergamo, casting pale winter light through my mother's kitchen window, something had shifted inside me. I cannot call it hope, not exactly. My rational mind still told me that my mother was dying, that no prayer would change the cancer consuming her body. But there was something else now, something like a tiny flame flickering in the vast darkness. If this teenager could face death with such, if his intercession had truly helped others in desperate situations, then perhaps there was still some possibility I had not considered. Perhaps the doors were not all closed. I woke my mother gently that morning, helping her sit up in bed and arranging the pillows behind her back. She was very weak, her breathing labored, her eyes heavy with exhaustion and the accumulation of pain medications that dulled her suffering but also dimmed her awareness. I told her about Carlo Acutis, speaking softly in the quiet of her bedroom, the morning light filtering through the curtains she had hung 30 years ago when she and my father first moved into this apartment. I told her about his life, his faith, his death, his beatification. I told her about the miracle in Brazil, about the other testimonies I had read, about the people who believed in his intercession. She listened with her eyes half closed, too weak for much response, but I saw her nod slightly when I suggested that we pray for his intercession. I pulled up the official prayer for his canonization on my phone and read it aloud, my voice trembling in the quiet of. I asked Carlo Acutis to intercede with God on my mother's behalf, to bring healing if it was God's will, to give us strength regardless of the outcome. My mother's lips moved slightly as I prayed, forming the words even though no sound came out. When I finished, she opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Peace, perhaps? Or acceptance? Or something else entirely that I did not have words to describe. Over the following days, I continued praying to Carlo Acutis with increasing intensity. I found a novena dedicated to him online and began praying it faithfully each morning and evening. 9 days of structured prayer, asking for his intercession. I told Luca about what I was doing, calling him in Munich to explain this sudden devotion to a teenager neither of us had really known about before. He was skeptical. I could hear it in his voice, the same rational skepticism that had made him such a successful pharmaceutical researcher. But he did not dismiss me. He agreed to join me in the prayers, reciting them each night with Heike and the children. Roberto, ever supportive even when he did not entirely understand my spiritual impulses, prayed the novena with me each evening in our apartment. I returned from my mother's side. Even little Matteo, only 5 years old, learned to say a simple prayer, asking Carlo to help Nonna get better. Father Domenico visited on December 22nd, expecting to find my mother further declined, perhaps already in the final hours. Instead, he found me sitting by her bed, reading aloud from a book about Acutis that I had ordered online and received that morning, a biography written by one of the teachers that detailed his short life and his extraordinary faith. I explained to the priest what I was doing, how I had discovered this young Beato in my darkest hour and felt drawn to seek his intercession. Father Domenico listened with a gentle patience that did not quite hide his concern. He was worried, I could tell, that I was setting myself up for an even greater devastation. He had seen families grasp at false hopes before, clutching at straws when the waves were already closing over their heads. He did not want to see me shattered further when those hopes proved empty. But he did not discourage me. Instead, he sat down in the chair beside my mother's bed and told me that faith sometimes leads us down unexpected paths, that God works in ways we cannot predict or understand. He reminded me of the story of the persistent widow in the Gospel of Luke, how Jesus praised her for continuing to plead her case before an unjust judge, even when it seemed hopeless. Persistence in prayer, he said, was never wasted, even when the prayers were not answered in the way we hoped. He suggested that if praying for Carlo Acutis' intercession brought me comfort and strengthened my faith, then I should continue, while remaining open to whatever outcome God intended. He promised to include my mother in his own prayers for Carlo's intercession, adding his voice to ours in this unexpected appeal. December 23rd was a dark day, the darkest yet. My mother could barely swallow water, her throat constricted by weakness, and the effects of the cancer that was now visible in every wasted feature of her face. Her breathing had become labored, each exhale a struggle against the failing machinery of her skin was the color of old wax, stretched thin over bones that seemed to grow more prominent by the hour. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing me, and sometimes staring past me at things I could not see. Dr. Bianchi came for what she clearly expected to be one of the final visits. She examined my mother with gentle hands and sorrowful eyes, checking vital signs that told the same story they had been telling for days. Then she took me aside, into the kitchen where we could speak privately, and said that the end was likely very near. Perhaps Christmas Eve, perhaps Christmas Day, but almost certainly within the next 48 hours. My mother's organs were shutting down in the predictable cascade that accompanied terminal cancer. Her kidneys were failing, her liver was failing. Her heart was working harder than it should just to keep blood circulating through her deteriorating body. We should say our goodbyes. We should make peace with what was. That night, I prayed the novena with a desperation I had. I knelt beside my mother's bed, rosary beads clutched in my hands, and I begged Carlo Acutis to intercede. I spoke to him not as a saint on an altar, but as a teenager, a boy who had faced his own death with courage and faith, a young man who understood what it meant to watch your body fail, while your spirit remained strong. I told him about my mother, about the children she had taught for 35 years, about the grandchildren who needed her, about the faith she had lived her entire life. I asked him to take our prayers before the throne of God, to plead our case in the heavenly courts, to ask for a miracle if it was God's will. I prayed until my knees ached, and my throat was raw from whispered supplications, until the words began to blur together, and I was no longer sure if I was speaking aloud or only in my heart. Christmas Eve morning, I woke from a few hours of fitful sleep on the sofa to the sound of my mother's voice. This alone was remarkable, startling enough to jerk me from sleep into immediate alertness. She had barely spoken in days, her words reduced to whispered monosyllables when she could manage them at all, her voice weakened to the point of inaudibility. But there she was, calling my name clearly enough to wake me from the next room, her voice carrying through the apartment with a strength that should have been impossible. I rushed to her bedside, my heart pounding, expecting the worst, expecting the surge of energy that sometimes precedes death, the so-called rally that gives false hope before the final decline. Instead, I found my mother sitting partially upright in bed, propped against her pillows in a position she had not been able to move. Her eyes were more alert than they had been since before the chemotherapy started, focusing on me with a clarity that seemed almost unnatural given her condition. She said she was thirsty, actually thirsty, a sensation she had not reported in days because patients had suppressed even basic bodily. She asked if she could have some tea, the specific request of a person engaged with the world, not the vague murmurings lost in the... I made the tea with trembling hands, half convinced I was dreaming, unable to process what I was witnessing. I helped her hold the cup, though she seemed stronger than she had been, and watched in amazement as she drank nearly the entire contents. She said she felt different somehow. She could not explain it exactly. Something had changed in the night. She had dreamed, she told me, or perhaps it had been more than a dream. She had felt a warmth spreading through her body, starting in her chest and radiating outward until it reached every extremity. She had sensed a presence beside her, comforting and peaceful, telling her without words that she was not alone. She did not know who or what this presence was, but she had woken feeling changed, feeling as if something fundamental had shifted inside her. I called Dr. Bianchi immediately, and though it was Christmas Eve and she surely had 100 other demands on her time, she came within 2 hours. Her examination was thorough and increasingly puzzled. My mother's vital signs, which had been steadily declining for weeks, in a trajectory as predictable as gravity, had stabilized. Her blood pressure was stronger, her pulse was more regular, her color seemed slightly better, less of the deathly yellow, and more of something approaching normal flesh tone. Her alertness was markedly improved, and she was able to answer questions coherently, something she had not managed in nearly a week. Dr. Bianchi said nothing definitive, warning me that dying patients sometimes have brief rallies before the final decline, moments of false hope that make the eventual loss even more painful. But I could see the confusion in her eyes, the furrow in her brow, as she reviewed her notes and compared them to what she was observing. This was not what she had expected to find. Christmas Day passed in a strange suspension between hope and fear, between joy and terror. My mother ate small amounts of food, the first solid nutrition she had taken in days. She managed a few spoonfuls of broth, a bit of soft bread soaked in warm milk, a taste of the panettone that Roberto brought over from our. She was awake for several hours, talking with us about inconsequential things, asking about Matteo's excitement Christmas, remembering Christmases past when Luca and I were children. She even smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eye. And Matteo showed her the toy fire. Luca and I exchanged glances throughout, neither of us willing to say aloud what we were both thinking. This was not how the end was. This was not the trajectory that terminal cancer followed. On December 26th, Dr. Bianchi ordered new blood tests, unable to explain what she was observing, and unwilling to rely solely on clinical impressions when she had laboratory tools at her disposal. The results came back the following day, with anomalies she could not account for. The cancer markers that had been steadily rising for months, climbing ever higher as the disease progressed and the chemotherapy failed, had inexplicably dropped. Not dramatically, not enough to suggest remission, but noticeably, significantly, in a direction that made no sense given the circumstances. He ordered a CT scan to see what was happening inside my mother's body, to visualize the tumors that had been spreading unchecked, to understand what the blood work was telling. I will never forget the moment when Dr. Bianchi called me into her office at the hospital to discuss the scan results. It was December 29th, less than a week after she had told me to say my goodbyes, less than a week after she had predicted my mother would not survive the holiday. I sat in the chair across from her desk, my hands clasped in my lap, my heart racing with a mixture of hope and terror. She had the images displayed on her computer screen, and for a long moment she simply stared at them without speaking, her fingers moving the cursor back and forth as she compared different views. Then she turned to me with an expression I had never seen on a physician's face before. It was something between bewilderment and awe, something that bordered on fear. The tumors were shrinking. She said the words slowly, as if she did not quite believe them herself. Not just stabilizing, not just pausing their growth in some temporary plateau, actively shrinking, retreating, becoming smaller in measurable, documentable ways. The primary tumor in the pancreas, the mass that had been the source of all this devastation, had reduced by nearly 30% since her last scan in early December. The metastatic lesions in the liver, which had been growing inexorably for months, were markedly smaller. The lymph node involvement, which had spread the cancer throughout her body, appeared to be decreasing. Dr. Bianchi showed me the comparison images, the before and after, placing them side by side on her screen, and even to my untrained eye the difference was obvious. Something that should not be happening was happening. She asked me if my mother had received any treatment elsewhere, any experimental therapy, any clinical trial medication that she might not have been informed about. She asked if someone had given my mother herbal supplements or alternative treatments or anything at all that might explain what she was seeing. I told her no, nothing but prayers. Nothing but the novena to Carlo Acutis that we had been praying for the past. Nothing but the desperate pleading, professionally skeptical but visibly shaken. She said she wanted to run more tests, wanted to monitor the situation closely, wanted to understand what was happening before drawing any conclusions. She was a scientist, trained to seek natural explanations for natural phenomena. But I could see that she was confronting something that her training had not prepared. The tests continued through early January 23, and with each one, the medical team's confusion grew deeper. My mother's condition was not just stable, but actively improving in ways that defied everything they knew about pancreatic cancer. Her appetite returned with remarkable force, and she began eating regular meals for the first time in months. Her strength began to rebuild, slowly at first, then more noticeably as the days passed. The jaundice that had yellowed her skin faded as her liver function improved, the toxic byproducts clearing from her blood as the organ regained its capacity to filter and cleanse. She started getting out of bed on her own, walking short distances at first, then longer ones, her muscles remembering patterns of movement they had seemingly forgotten. Dr. Bianchi consulted with colleagues throughout Italy and beyond, sending the scans to specialists in Milan and Rome, to oncologists who had spent their careers studying pancreatic cancer and its invariably fatal progression. Nobody could explain what they were seeing. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer with metastasis does not spontaneously regress. The disease does not reverse itself. The tumors do not shrink without treatment. The medical literature contained perhaps a handful of documented cases of spontaneous regression over decades of research, each one scrutinized and debated and ultimately filed away as an unexplained anomaly, a statistical outlier in a disease that otherwise followed predictable patterns. Now there was another one, happening in real time, in a hospital in Bergamo, to a 63-year-old retired teacher named Giuliana Rossetti. By mid-January, my mother was well enough to leave her apartment for the first time in months. Luca had to return to Munich, his leave exhausted, and his job demanding his presence. But he left with tears of joy rather than grief, embracing our mother at the door of her apartment and promising to visit again soon with him. I helped my mother walk slowly around the block where she had lived for 40 years, her arm linked through mine, both of us weeping as neighbors stopped to stare at the woman they had assumed was already dead. They had seen her decline, had heard the whispered predictions of her imminent path, had perhaps already begun to mourn in their own private ways. Now here she was, walking in the winter sunshine, frail but alive, impossible but real. Father Domenico came to visit on a Thursday afternoon in late January and found my mother sitting up in her living room, drinking coffee and eating the almond biscotti she had loved all her life. He had prepared himself for a deathbed visit, perhaps a final anointing, perhaps the prayers for the moment of death that he had been expecting to offer for more than a month. Instead, he found himself facing something that challenged every rational category he possessed. He sat with my mother for a long time that afternoon, listening as she told him about the prayers to Carlo Acutis, about the night when everything changed, about the feeling she had experienced in the darkness, a warmth spreading through her body, a sense that she was not alone, that someone was interceding for her in a place beyond ordinary sight. Father Domenico wept openly as he listened, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He had been a priest for 40 years. He had administered countless sacraments, heard thousands of confessions, presided over weddings and funerals, and every milestone in between. But he had never witnessed anything like this. A woman he had anointed for death was now offering him coffee in her living room, stronger with each passing day, defying every prediction and every expectation. He said later that it had renewed his own faith in ways he could not adequately express, that seeing my mother's recovery had reminded him why he had become a priest in the first place. By February, my mother was strong enough to attend Mass again. I will never forget walking into Santa Maria Immacolata with her on that Sunday morning, feeling the eyes of the congregation turned toward us, hearing the whispers and gasps as people recognized the woman they had been praying for, the woman they had expected to bury before Christmas. Some people crossed themselves, others began to cry openly. Father Domenico acknowledged her presence during the announcements, his voice breaking with emotion as he spoke of the mysterious ways of God and the power of intercessory prayer. He did not claim certainty about what had happened. He simply stated the facts. Giuliana Rossetti had been dying, and now she was not, and this had occurred after her family had prayed for the intercession of Blessed Carlo Acutis. The follow-up scans in March 2023 showed continued regression that bordered on the miraculous. The primary tumor had shrunk by over 70% from its original size. Several of the metastatic lesions in the liver had disappeared entirely, leaving only faint shadows where tumors had once threatened her life. Others had reduced to mere fractions of their former dimensions. The lymph node involvement had decreased dramatically. Dr. Bianchi no longer used words like remission, which implies a response to treatment that can be explained by medical science. She used words like unprecedented, like medically inexplicable, like impossible by any known mechanism. She had been practicing oncology for 25 years, she told me, and she had never seen anything like this. She asked my mother if she would be willing to have her case documented, to contribute to the medical literature as an example of spontaneous regression. My mother agreed without hesitation, understanding that her story might help researchers understand something important about cancer and recovery and the limits of current medical knowledge. Over the following months, her medical records were compiled and reviewed by oncologists throughout Italy and eventually beyond. The consensus was always the same. What had happened defied medical explanation. There was no treatment, no intervention, no natural process that could account for it. Father Domenico, meanwhile, had begun quietly documenting what had happened from a spiritual perspective. He contacted the diocesan office in Bergamo, aware that the church maintains a rigorous process for investigating potential miracles, particularly those that might support the causes of blessed individuals being considered for canonization. He did not claim certainty about what had occurred. He simply reported the facts as he knew them. A woman with terminal cancer, given days to live, had experienced a dramatic and medically inexplicable recovery immediately following prayers for the intercession of Blessed Carlo Acutis. The church would investigate in its own time and draw its own conclusions. His job was simply to make sure the proper authorities were informed. My mother celebrated her 64th birthday in May 2023, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, including Luca's family, who had flown in from Munich for the occasion. The apartment was filled with flowers and laughter, and the aroma of her favorite foods, which she helped prepare with her own hands the first time. She blew out the candles on her birthday cake, the same buttercream cake she had made for my birthdays and Luca's birthdays, and countless other celebrations over the decades. When someone asked what she had wished for, she smiled and said she had everything she needed. She was alive. Her family was healthy. God had given her more time and she intended to use it well. She returned to her walking group, though she took it easier now than she used to, her body still recovering from the assault it had endured. She volunteered at the parish again, helping with catechism classes, teaching children about the Eucharist, with an intensity that carried the weight of personal experience. She told everyone who would listen about Carlo Acutis, about the teenager who had become her unexpected intercessor, about the night when everything changed. Some people listened politely and said nothing. Others asked questions, wanting to know more about this young beato who had seemingly heard a dying woman's prayers. A few began their own devotions to Carlo, inspired by my mother's testimony. I have thought often about why this happened to us, why my mother was spared when so many others are not. I do not have an answer that satisfies the question. I have known people of profound faith who died of cancer despite fervent prayers, despite novenas and pilgrimages and all the spiritual weapons the church has to offer. I have known families who prayed for miracles and received only the comfort of knowing their loved ones died surrounded by love. I cannot explain why my mother's story turned out differently. I cannot fit it into any theological framework that makes complete sense. What I can say is that the experience transformed my understanding of faith and prayer and the relationship between heaven and earth. Before my mother's illness, my Catholicism was largely habitual, inherited from my parents, and practiced without much deep reflection. I believed in God the way I believed in the laws of physics, accepting the existence of a higher power, a background assumption rather than a lived reality. I prayed the prayers I had been taught, attended Mass on Sundays, observed the commandments and the precepts of the church, but I had never really expected God to intervene directly in my life. I had never truly believed that prayers could change outcomes in the physical world, that intercession could bridge the gap between mortal desperation and divine power. Now I know differently, not because I understand how or why such interventions occur, but because I experienced one. I held my mother's hand as she was dying. I heard the doctors say there was nothing more to be done. I watched the priest administer last rites. I saw the monitors showing vital signs that pointed only toward death. And then, I watched my mother come back from the edge of the grave in a way that no one could explain, starting from the moment we began praying for the 15-year-old boy who died in 2006. Carlo Acutis once said that the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. He believed that through the Eucharist, we have direct access to Jesus Christ, as present and alive as he was walking the roads of Galilee 2,000 years ago. I think about that belief often now, sitting in church during Mass, watching the priest elevate the consecrated host. I think about how Carlo maintained his faith even as leukemia destroyed his young body, how he offered his suffering for the Pope and for the Church, how he trusted completely in God's love, even when that love seemed to demand his death at 15 years old. My mother keeps a picture of Carlo Acutis on her knife next to the photographs of my father and her grandmother. She talks to him sometimes. I have heard her through the door, thanking him for his intercession, asking him to continue praying for our family, sharing with him the small joys and concerns of her daily life. She has visited his tomb in Assisi twice since her kneeling before the young Beatos with tears streaming, touching the glass that separates the living from the blessed, from those who have gone before us marked with the. As for me, I have become something I never expected to be, a witness to the unexpected. I tell this story when people ask, and they do ask, because word has spread through our community about what happened to Giuliana Rossetti. I tell it simply, without embellishment, because the facts themselves are extraordinary enough. I do not argue with skeptics or try to convince anyone who has already decided that such things cannot. I simply say what I experienced: the diagnosis, the decline, the absolute closure of every door, the discovery of Carlo Acutis, the prayers, the inexplicable reversal, the doctor's bewilderment, my mother's continuing life. They can make of it what they will. I know what I saw. Sometimes people ask me if I ever doubt what happened, if I ever wonder whether there might be some natural explanation we simply have not discovered yet. I answer honestly, yes. Sometimes I wonder. I am a teacher, trained to value evidence and reason. Part of me will always look for logical explanations, will always be slightly uncomfortable with claims that defy scientific understanding. But then I look at my mother, alive and well, 2 years after she was, and the wondering fades. Whatever happened in that dark December was real, saved her life. And it came after we asked for the intercession of Acutis. The young beato who loved computers and catalogued Eucharistic miracles has become an unexpected member of our family. We speak of him casually now, the way you might speak of a beloved relative who lives far away, but remains present in your thoughts. And we include him in our daily devotions without self-conscious, feeling connected to him in a way that transcends the usual boundaries between the living and the dead. He heard us when we called out in our desperation. He answered in a way that none of us expected. My mother is sitting in her living room as I write these words, 2 years after she should have died, reading a book about the saints that Father Domenico gave her. The winter sunlight falls across her face. illuminating features I thought I would never see. He looks up and catches smiles. That same warm smile that a family for as long as I can be is alive. Against all odds, against all expectations, against everything the doctors and priests believe possible, he is alive. Thank you, Carlo Acutis. Thank you for hearing us in our darkest hour. Thank you for interceding when we had nothing left but despair. Thank you for bringing the unexpected to our family. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to learn more about Carlo Acutis and to seek his intercession in your own life. Subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story of faith and the unexpected miracles that remind us God is always at work in our world.